All right.
We're on
waiting
YouTube. YouTube is running. Sean's kind of doing 2 meetings at once, so he told me he was going to start YouTube at 10:30.
Sounds good. Thanks, Dennis. Yeah, we're still waiting for Ryan Redmond, who one of our guests, and Antonio informed me that he had a last-minute work meeting get scheduled right over our meeting time, so he unfortunately won't be able to make it, but we'll be following up and checking out the meeting video in the minutes. I'm just trying to think. I think we have. Do we have everybody else?
Sharon.
Oh no, we're still missing Dennis.
Yeah, we're waiting on Dennis.
We'll give it just one more minute here, I think.
Here's Ryan. I'm admitting him now. So we're waiting on Dan.
Welcome, Ryan. Thanks for being here. Sharon, welcome.
Hello.
We're just gonna give her one more minute, see if Dennis Smith can hop on. Otherwise, I think everybody else is here. All right. Well, I haven't heard from Dennis. He may be able, hopefully he'll be able to join us. I think in the interest of time, and respecting our guests' time, especially, we can get going here. So thank you to everybody for being here. We'll call the meeting to order. Looks like with our roll call, we have Wayne Primo and Bob Chapman and Stephanie Jones, Jackie Stark, Mark Curran, myself, and it looks like we're just right now missing Antonio, who will be absent, and Dennis Smith absent for the moment. And then Sharon's here, of course, as well as our ex officio member. So thank you all for being here. And do I have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Support.
Great. Any discussion? If not, take a vote. All in favor, please say yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
All opposed, please say no. Abstaining. That passes unanimously. Public comment. Do we have any public comment for our meeting today, Dennis?
I have 0 public comment.
I haven't gotten anything emailed to me either, so I guess we'll go ahead to new business. Do I have a motion? The first item, approval of our March 25th, 2021 special meeting minutes. We have a motion to approve those March 25th minutes.
I'll move we approve the minutes. March
2nd.
Great. All right. Moved by Bob, seconded by Stephanie. Any discussion? If not, we'll take a vote. All in favor, please say yes.
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 No.
Yes.
Great. All opposed, please say no. All abstaining. Great. That passes unanimously. All right. Moving on to the real business of the day. So we have a couple of guests with us here. We've got Nick Emmendorfer from Room at the Inn, who's here to talk to us about homelessness in Marquette from his perspective. And also Ryan Redmond from Superior Housing Solutions, who can share a little bit about homelessness as well, but is especially going to be talking to us about permanent supportive housing in Marquette. So I think this is definitely an area where we got a lot of feedback after our initial report was released, where we could have spent more time in that report, a little bit more time discussing homelessness and low income housing and the needs of lower income folks in our community. So that's my goal for this meeting, is that we have at least one meeting where we're talking about these issues, which are very important. So I just want to welcome both of them. My plan here is just that I think what we'll do is Nick will give a presentation, and then Ryan will give a presentation, and then we will do a Q&A with both of them afterwards. We should be able to budget at least 20 minutes for Q&A from the committee with both of them. So if people have questions for that long. So with that, Nick, I don't know if you want to go ahead and share your screen and get going with your presentation.
Yeah, just making sure that you made me host so I can do that.
Oh, I don't know if I can make you host. Dennis, do you know?
You should be able to, Nick. I was able to.
Okay.
Yeah, you should be able to.
If we could really quick, just because I haven't gotten the chance yet, could we go quick and do some introductions briefly?
Yeah, of course. Sorry. I should have thought of that. Thanks, Nick.
You're okay.
Yeah, so of course, I'm Evan Bonzel. I'm the chair of the committee and I serve on the city commission. And then I guess we can just, if other folks want to quickly introduce themselves, that would be great.
I'm Bob Chapman. I'm retired from the Michigan Rehabilitation Service, and I'm interested in rights and protection for people with disabilities.
Stephanie Jones, Select Realty.
Mark Curran, Curran & Company, developer.
I'm Jackie Stark. I'm a member of the Marquette Housing Commission, which is why I'm on this board.
Dennis?
I'm Dennis Stackwitz. Nick, we met. I'm the community development director. I'm not on the board, but I am their liaison from the staff.
And Wayne?
Pretty Primo, contractor.
And I know Dave, but go ahead, Dave.
We also have Sharon here from the Marquette Housing Commission. She's the executive director.
Hello, sorry, I should have introduced myself.
Oh, Sharon. Oh,
And the City of Marquette logo is actually a ghost. It's just it's just the ghost host for the meeting.
And then again, I'm Nick Emmendorfer. I'm executive director of Room Inn, born and raised in Marquette. Happy to be here with you all today. Ryan, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure thing. Ryan Redmond, the executive director of Superior Housing Solutions.
Okay, all right. So I'm going to share screen and go into a Prezi, which is basically a PowerPoint for people with ADD. Helps keep people focused. I think it's much more interactive. It's really hard to put my 2 years of work at Room at the Inn into perspective for all of you. I could probably sit here for another pretty much all day and machine gun information to you, but I'm going to try to do it in a concise and organized manner, and I'm going to keep it to about I'm going to try to keep it under 10 minutes, but certainly no more than 15. You may hear some overlap in Ryan's and mine presentation, but if you're here for an educational experience, if you hear something twice, in my eyes, that just means you write it down because it's important. All right, so here we go. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. All right. So I'm going to go through this slide best I can one by one and talk about Room at the Inn and homelessness in Marquette. Okay, so number one, Room at the Inn 101. Room at the Inn is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to provide food, shelter, and assistance to individuals transitioning out of homelessness. Now, we didn't just pop up out of nowhere. We have a history behind our organization, and I'll briefly touch on that. Room at the Inn started in 2007 by a volunteer by the name of Helen McCormick. So that's the Helen McCormick story. Helen McCormick was a volunteer at St. Vincent de Paul back in 2007. She encountered a man who had nowhere to sleep during one of her volunteer shifts. That encounter motivated Helen to start organizing our community with church leaders, officials from different agencies, to come together and start what was a rotating shelter through our local churches. So that's 2007. In 2010, Room at the Inn became an official nonprofit, 501c3. In 2014, Room at the Inn obtained our first property, the building that all of you are probably most familiar with on Washington Street. That is our warming center. And we got that with two purposes, with the objective to, one, provide daytime services to guests, so they have a place to go when they're not sheltered at the churches. And we also use the upstairs apartment of the building for some income. From 2007 to 2020, Room at the Inn operated a high barrier, and I'll get into what that means later, rotating shelter staffed by mostly volunteers. There's only 3 paid staff. Everything else, the nighttime, the dinners, the warming center, was all run by volunteers, which is something Marquette should really be proud of. And we used 12 local churches, and we hosted about 15 to 20 individuals a night over that time span. Some challenges that were here when I first arrived as executive director. I started as a volunteer in 2014 at the warming center, but I came into the executive director role in 2019 in February. And some things I noticed with everything, we had a poor relationship with the community, poor relationship with the churches. We didn't have trained staff. It was wonderful that we had so many volunteers, but you need well-trained staff to have an effective shelter operation. There's lack of funding to provide the level of services that was needed in the community. And there was just a general lack of services and best practices at the shelter. For instance, we were only open from 6 a.m. until 11 a.m. And for the rest of the day, the people that stayed in the shelter were pretty much left to their own resources to go to the library or hang out at local businesses. And throughout the day, they didn't have a place to go. So those are some things I'm happy that today we've been able to change. So that's a brief touch on the history behind Room at the Inn. So let's take a look at what we have today. Today, Room at the Inn offers a 24/7, so that's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, low barrier, permanent emergency shelter at the warming center. That used to be only for daytime services. We have renovated the building to be a full capacity shelter. All our services can be accessed under one roof at the warming center. We have a capacity with 30 beds and some room for overflow. We provide free meals, 3 free meals daily to guests. We offer case management through our guest advocate, which is similar to a social worker. And we refer guests to other agencies such as Superior Housing Solutions, Great Lakes Recovery, Community Action, Goodwill, etc. We provide shower and laundry services because we believe that cleanliness is a basic part of human dignity. We also provide mail and phone service because if you're homeless and need to work on a housing plan, you need to have the ability to get a hold of agencies, and agencies need to have the ability to get a hold of you. That's what we do. And I want to talk about what the role of a shelter is in a community. You need to start thinking of your emergency shelter no different than you think of your emergency room. You go to your emergency room when you're in a medical crisis. You go to your emergency shelter when you're in a housing crisis. You don't have a place to stay. Now, notice that in the medical field, the emergency room, you don't go there bleeding out and then with a wound on your chest and then stay there for a long-term care. You're there for a short visit to get triage and assess of what the damage is and to stop the crisis in place. But it's not a long-term solution. It's an emergency response. So effective shelters identify all people experiencing homelessness, prevents homelessness whenever possible, provides access to the shelter through coordinated entry. And that's just a buzzword that means that there's organization to the process of getting in the shelter and who gets in. And it quickly connects people who experience homelessness with housing assistance or services tailored to the unique strengths and needs of that household. In short, if we want to have an effective shelter, we want the stays at the shelter to be short, Nationwide, 80% of shelter stays are less than 30 days, and that should remain to be a goal for us. We want to have a housing-focused approach in our shelter. We want it to be low barrier so everyone can access it, but from the second somebody steps in the shelter, for the entire period that they remain in the shelter, the focus from our staff and volunteers and the guests have to be, you are here to work on a housing plan. You are not here to stay. This is not a final destination. This is a place, well, while you're here, you will be working on transitioning out of homelessness and into an appropriate housing program based on your needs. The final piece for an effective shelter in Marquette is going to be that the services are easily accessible. Everyone needs to know how to access the shelter. Everyone needs to know the number to call. Same thing as the emergency room. Again, there's no question of where the emergency room is or how to get there. You call 911, you get an ambulance if you can't get there yourself. That's just common knowledge. We need to have that same level of understanding for our homeless shelters because, again, it is a response to an emergency. This is just a look at some of the agencies that Room at the Inn partners with: Upper Great Lakes, Lutheran Social Services, Salvation Army, VA, Superior Housing Solutions. We partner with the police department, the public defender's office, the Marquette Health Department, Superior Housing Solutions, Community Action, the list goes on. All of these partners help us to provide better services to our guests. And a lot of these agencies come directly to the shelter to provide their services to our guests. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over best practices. Just know that Room at the Inn is undergoing a culture change where we want to make sure that our practices in the shelter are what's considered best practices from consultants from our state partners. And some examples of that might be, we got rid of our breathalyzer, which was a long time barrier we had to entry at Room at the Inn. We used to breathalyze all guests before coming in, and that's a barrier to entry. And it's kind of a silly barrier because if you're going to offer a shelter to homeless people, but then you're going to say, oh, okay, only people who don't have addiction, mental illness, criminal history, who have all their documentation, only those people can stay. Well, you're not going to have homeless people having access to your shelter. So getting rid of barriers like those really just helps people who need the service get the service. And also it helps us shift our thinking for how we interact with guests at the shelter. Churches were terrified of getting rid of the breathalyzer because they were afraid of the behaviors that would arise. What we found out is that if you just make the behavior the standard, instead of worrying about whether it was a mental illness, drugs, alcohol, just bad upbringing causing a behavior, we changed the rules. So now just the behavior is your standard for entry. As long as you're being respectful, can walk a straight line and communicate with others, you're welcome in our shelter. So when someone presents for shelter, what's the process for getting them into the shelter? The first thing is we go through a diversion process, which just means that our guest advocate goes through all possible questions interviewing somebody, saying, hey, is this truly your last resort? We want to make sure if somebody's utilizing shelter that they absolutely need it and they've exhausted all other resources. Second is we do an assessment. What level of acuity are you? Are you dealing with a serious criminal history and addiction and a bunch of afflictions that prevent you from getting housing? Or do you have a low acuity, meaning you might be easily housed with only a matter of weeks? We have to assess what level of service you need. And the final thing, after we've hopefully diverted you if possible and assessed you, the final thing we're going to do is try to find an appropriate referral for you that fits your housing needs. Okay, so that we just talked a little bit about the history behind Room at the Inn, our services. I want to talk about some stats to give perspective on how many homeless people there are. So going through this as quickly as I can. This is from the 2019 PIT count, point in time count, a census on homeless people. In 2019, 567,715 people experienced homelessness across the United States. About 2/3 of them were sheltered. How does that compare with Michigan? 2019, 2,056 people were homeless in the state of Michigan, which made up 3% of the state's population. Michigan is divided into 8 regions, or I'm sorry, excuse me, there's a few more, I think it's 10 regions. But the important thing to remember is that in the eyes of the Michigan Coalition to End Homelessness, the Upper Peninsula is Region 1. And again, we make up 3% of the entire state's homeless population. That's down from 2018, where we made up 5% of the whole state's homeless population. Some statistics from Room at the Inn. 2017-18, we had 115 people stay with us. The average length of stay was less than 1 month. Some more current statistics from Room at the Inn. For this year, 50 guests have stayed with Room at the Inn. 30 out of the 50 have been with us less than 20 days. The concerning piece is the people who have been with us for a long period of time. 8 guests at Room at the Inn have been here a year or longer. 4 of them have been in and out of homelessness for the last 2 years. And Ryan Redmond's presentation will help touch on some of the solutions for some of those long-term homeless people or chronically homeless people. For some perspective in what we had last year, in 2020, 122 different individuals utilized Room at the Inn. We currently have 30 people staying at the shelter, so that's some good news. Those 122 people didn't stay homeless. Most of them had a short stay at shelter until they were to find an alternative unit. Also, for some perspective on the affordability and housing options for these people, I looked at Marquette, the Facebook classifieds on Marquette County's Facebook page. 8 of the 10 units available on that Facebook page weren't even affordable with your standard MSHDA voucher, which is a voucher people receive for housing. So even if they got the housing voucher from MSHDA, they wouldn't be able to afford the apartment. And that doesn't even take into consideration if those apartments are MSHDA approved. Okay, this is an important thing to look at to understand that we're dealing with 2 different populations. On the bottom, you'll see a stagnant orange line. That's your chronically homeless population. People that have been homeless for longer than a year, have a disability, or they've been homeless longer than, they've been homeless 3 times in the last 4 years. You'll notice that that number remains the same between 2012 and 2017. However, what is increasing is the amount of people who have these short-term emergency shelter stays. These people who have no place else to go and run into these housing crises. This is what's the continuing issue for Marquette and homelessness. And I want to talk about more recent trends we've seen in increased homelessness. Okay, the one I just want to focus on in the interest of time, these graphs are from Community Action. Between September and February, Community Action provided funds so people would not lose their apartment. They had to present with an eviction notice to qualify for these funds. We went from 38 evictions requiring eviction diversion in September of 2020 to 111 people requiring eviction diversion in February. What this graph should tell you is that there is a serious increase in the amount of people at risk of eviction in Marquette County. So these aren't people who are homeless yet. These are people on the brink of being homeless. One thing I just want to make clear, I won't have time to go into the graphs, but when we're talking about homelessness, and you're in your discussions with the community about homelessness, people always ask me and probably ask Ryan, what causes homelessness? Is it mental illness, addiction? Is it criminal history? Those are not the issues. The issue is that people with and without those afflictions don't have a place to stay. And those issues such as mental illness, addiction, criminal history, those are all present in people with housing. They're not indicative of someone with mental illness is not assumed that we shouldn't assume they're going to be homeless. For instance, 40 million people across the United States experience mental illness. 39.4 million of those people are housed. We don't have to solve those issues to solve homelessness. We just have to provide the housing for them. And The traditional way of thinking about homelessness is that we have to fix somebody's criminal history, or we have to get somebody sober, or we have to get somebody a job, or we have to fix their relationship with their family, or we can't work harder than the social worker can't work harder than the person. Those are all ways of thinking which we're actually finding out in more recent years are false. People can better work on their addiction, their criminal history, their mental illness if you provide the housing first, and then they can work on those secondary afflictions so they can maintain their housing. And that's the focus this community needs to have. I'm going to send out this presentation after, and I don't want to take away from Ryan's time, but when you do get a chance to go into this presentation, take a look at the police contacts. One important data point, before Room at the Inn went to a permanent shelter, we had an average of 40 police contacts per month, which means that every time the police were called to a situation and the person was reported as homeless, they would send that in a report to us. We collected that data and we were able to show that without a permanent shelter, the average amount of times a Marquette police officer had to go have contact with a homeless person was 40 times per month. Since we opened our permanent shelter, there has been less than 8 contacts per month. We have reduced the burden on the police department and the community at large just by giving the people a place to go. This is a little bit how the system works, the continuum of care, as it's been called in the past. So someone goes from being housed, then they're homeless, then they go to Room at the Inn, where they're referred to community action, so they can get assessed and work on that housing plan. And then they're referred to the available housing programs you have in Marquette. You've got programs like the Jansen House, Superior Housing Solutions. You have low-income housing provided by the Marquette Housing Commission. You have rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing programs, which Ryan will touch on. Recovery housing and halfway housing. Now, to place people in these things, we have to assess them and we give people a score. Your acuity score is what determines what type of housing you get, in theory. If you're low acuity, a low acuity person would be someone like if Evan Bonzel became homeless tonight. I know Evan has a good education, has strong community support, and from my knowledge, Evan doesn't deal with a bad criminal record or addiction or any of the like. Evan would be a typical shelter stay where we expect him to be there for probably less than 30 days, and hopefully shorter than that. The reason being, we could probably get Evan a job pretty quick. We could probably find Evan a family member or friend to stay with pretty quickly. We could probably get Evan someone to couch surf with. He's low acuity and he's a self-resolve. He needs minimum case management to solve his homelessness. The next step up is medium acuity. So maybe let's take Evan again and say Evan also deals with criminal history and maybe some addiction issues. So he scores a medium acuity score. What we'll determine for Evan is that he needs a little bit more support than the average person. So we're going to provide Evan with a rapid rehousing referral. So his housing can be paid for an agreed upon amount of time. So he can have the housing part taken care of so he can focus on maybe his sobriety and working on finishing probation so that he can retain that housing for long term. And the final piece would be high acuity, which we want to give him permanent supportive housing. That's pretty simple too. It just means we want to give Evan adequate housing that supports his needs. And we also want to give him case management, wraparound services, where we might send a person daily to Evan's apartment to make sure that he's not disrupting the neighbors, that he has a good relationship with the landlord, that he's making his rent on time, etc. With that, I'm going to conclude. I'm a little bit over the time I wanted to have, but hopefully during the questions I can expand on some of this more. But that is in a nutshell homelessness, and I just quickly am going to go on just some takeaways from this. Big takeaway. Emergency shelter is just the first stop in your crisis response system. Again, the emergency room, you don't go there for your long-term care. You usually go there just for 1 or 2 days to get triaged and stabilized before you move on to a long-term housing plan. Those long-term housing plans have to be provided by the community, and it's a community responsibility to provide outlets. Number 2, Housing has to be the focus. We're not focused on addiction, mental health, criminal history. We are just focused on providing housing. A shelter is only as good as the outlets it has for housing programs. We can provide people with emergency shelter all day long, and we can do it in perpetuity. The community will only be appreciative of the shelter if it has an effective role in taking people in and exiting people out. Otherwise, it will be nothing more than an enabling service that allows people to sit and have free meals and a free place to go without ever working towards independence. The community also needs to be knowledgeable about the crisis response system. I don't have to spend any time today educating you guys about 911 and how that system works. That level of understanding that this community has for 911, we need to have that same level of understanding for this emergency response. Finally, we can get ahead of this issue in Marquette. Homelessness is not at the levels that it's at in Detroit, out on the West Coast and some bigger cities, on the East Coast and all the big cities around the United States. We're looking at 30 people in Marquette, and again, about 8 chronically homeless individuals. With minimal additional housing supports, we can put a huge dent in the homeless population in Marquette. And I think if we get on this now rather than later, the community will be proud of the homeless support system and the crisis response system we have to homelessness. And with that, I will wait till questions to expand. Sorry for going a little over, Ryan.
No worries at all, Nick. And Ryan, we'll still make sure to give you your full 15 minutes. I built a little bit of flexibility and a few minutes of flexibility into our schedule here. And I'm sure that we'll have plenty of questions where we can expand on some of those points that you might have skimmed over a little bit there, Nick. So thank you. Ryan, do you want to share your screen and introduce yourself and get going here?
Sure thing. Thanks, Evan. Thanks everybody for your time. Let me get this going here. Can everybody see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Good. Welcome everybody and thank you for your time. Superior Housing Solutions. Who are we? We're a 501c3 nonprofit based here in Marquette. We exist to ensure that all vulnerable individuals, including those that are homeless and or near homeless, have access to supportive housing that is safe, affordable, accessible, and appropriate to promote self-actualization in an inclusive and supportive community. What does that mean? It means that we're trauma-informed, we're evidence-based, we use best practices. We work with the chronically homeless, the addicted, and those in recovery. We work with those highest acuity people that Nick talked about in the highest need, and those that have fallen between the gaps of other services in the community. We are also a Matthew 25 organization. Why do we exist? In 2017, QPAD and Kayla West hosted a homelessness summit here in Marquette. There, Aubrey Paterno from Avalon Housing and Rick Klum from Minnesota came and they talked about some housing solutions that they offered in their communities. It was a housing first model, and some of the things that they offered was permanent supportive housing, recovery housing, and even a wet house. As a person in long-term recovery, I saw this as my calling, and I took it upon myself, and I traveled to Holland, Michigan, Petoskey, Detroit, Lansing, and I saw some of their services and how their local planning bodies worked, and decided to launch a 501c3 housing project. And I convened a board made up of community members that had hands-on experience for multiple years. Some of those members included people from Great Lakes Recovery, Child and Family Services, Catholic Social Services, and multiple RADI board members, room at the inn. And then finally, in March 9th of 2019, we received our 501c3 status and the work began. We first set out to open a recovery house here in Marquette, an intentional community. We found a location. It was a former boarding house in which the person was looking to relocate, but still wanted to offer vital services to this population. We negotiated a deal. We improved the living quarters, and hired staff. In trying to relocate the participants of that boarding house, we became intimately familiar with the housing barriers in Marquette, such as criminal history and lack of rental housing. So we opted to operate the Fisher Street location as a transitional and supported living community. And then we finally found our intentional community, our recovery residence, in July of 2020. There are numerous successful homeless services in Marquette and in our region. Those include Community Action, Room at the Inn, and the Jansen House. However, there are still gaps in services. One of those being, like in February of this year, there was a person that was discharged from the shelter. We contacted all the local agencies. There was literally no place for this person to go. Superior Housing Solutions absorbed them and were able to give those people emergency shelter, as well as a facilitated treatment stay in which that participant completed. Another example of that would be Larry. Larry was someone that I actually received a phone call from a city commissioner that, there was an individual on the beach. There was a lot of garbage and debris around this person. So we deployed our street outreach team. We met Larry where he was at. We helped facilitate him going back to the shelter. And then we connected him with Community Action. Unfortunately, even though we had all those supports in place, Larry got COVID-19 and was in the hospital, and the hospital wouldn't release Larry because he didn't have his own place to stay. And unfortunately, Larry passed in the hospital, and permanent supportive housing was the answer for Larry. Some services we offer, we do street outreach, where we literally and figuratively meet them where they're at, recovery coaching, supportive housing, recovery housing, and we deployed a workforce development program to put our individuals to work. This is our organizational chart. This is how we're able to make all of our services and our case management happen. Our street outreach team. This team is double-breasted. It is a MSHDA side and a social determinants of health side. This program literally and figuratively meets people where they're at. We go to the streets and encampments. We provide clothing, trash bags to facilitate some cleanups. We have community health workers and recovery coaches to support them, and either link them back up to a shelter or possibly a treatment facilitation where they can receive treatment for their substance use. And then the other side would be our document readiness side, where we are in the shelters and also going to the streets and encampments to make sure that those people have birth certificates, social security cards, IDs, and anything necessary to navigate the housing and systems that we have in place. This picture here to the right is someone that our street outreach team came across in November of 2020. It was about 20 degrees outside of Messiah Lutheran on this particular day. The male in this couple was discharged from the shelter, and them being a couple, they decided to stay together, and this is where we found them in November. More on this couple later. So our Fisher Street location, this is a harm reduction model. There's no length of stay. House meetings and chore participation is mandatory. We do community involvement through community service projects. This house is supported with community health workers and recovery coaches, as well as ACT from Pathways and a live-in house manager. The Fisher Street location has also acted as a safety net for the community during the COVID-19 pandemic. We provided emergency shelter to 7 individuals who were discharged during the pandemic. Again, this couple here was found in November of 2020 outside of Messiah Lutheran. Our recovery residence is an intentional community where it meets NAR and MAR standards. It's a nationally accredited program. They have access to resources. It's a structured living environment, which means they have a routine to follow and mandatory meetings and such to abide by. There's community building through community service projects. Each one of the participants in this particular program, if they are not working full-time, they are to do 20 hours of community service each week that they're in the house. We facilitate most of that community service through the United Way, a webpage called Youpers Helping Youpers. Our workforce development program is a supervised work team that puts our homeless and people in recovery to work. A lot of times there's no work history and it's hard for these individuals to get a job. So this puts them on the right path to being able to get that workflow routine in place. This is also community building through active participation in their communities. We have launched a subset of our workforce development is a light duty construction team to facilitate any maintenance and improvements on the houses that we have currently. This came into play during the February cold snap when our pipes froze 3 times. And here are some pictures of the projects we've done. We remodeled the RISA building for Goodwill, and we also do a lot of sorting projects for Goodwill. Here's a garden project that we put in the community at the Fisher Street. And then our most recent addition to Superior Housing Solutions is we were able to acquire a property in Ishpeming. That couple that we found outside of Messiah Lutheran, that we were able to facilitate an emergency stay at our Fisher Street location. They went from that right into this house. This is them receiving their keys to the house. And in this house, we provide support through our street outreach team, like we do in multiple other facilities in the community. We support people at the Housing Commission and other individual landlords throughout the region. We do wraparound care. We make sure that they're going to their doctor's appointments and receiving their medications as needed. This is vital in sustainability of housing. Solutions. Superior Housing Solutions is committed to ending homelessness by taking the next on that by name list that Nick talked about, those that are of the highest acuity. Through our knowledge gained through our housing services and our housing support services and our harm reduction model, we are a prime candidate to launch permanent supportive housing here in Marquette. Barriers that some of you are familiar with, or maybe not. There's a lack of units. Currently, I believe the numbers that were out were around for the region, which is Region 1, was around 300 units that are needed for permanent supportive housing, and we have less than 10 in the region. There's zoning. Permanent supportive housing is not included in the zoning code for the city of Marquette. There's stigma, public perception and willingness because of the lack of knowledge and understanding of the support systems that are in place with permanent supportive housing. And then, of course, the real estate market and available properties. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, Ryan. That's I think we're going to be a really good jumping off point for our question and answer session here. So I think that we can do it about at least 15 to 20 minutes of questions and answers from the committee, as long as we have people who want to ask questions. I would just briefly kick it off myself by asking both of you if you could name, one or two, at least one or two specific policy changes, or just things, even if they're not policy changes, right? Things that the city of Marquette specifically could do to help your organizations operate better, and more specifically to help the people that you're serving.
You want to do 1, 2, Ryan? We'll each take 1, 2 at it.
Sure.
All right, so I'll start. Specifically, what I would say, if the city could do one thing it would be to increase the amount of rapid rehousing units that are available, what qualifies for rapid rehousing. I have some data I can share with the committee about some recent studies that were done in the area to show how much rapid rehousing is needed and how much permanent supportive housing is needed. In fact, I could share that right now if you want to see it.
I would like that.
Okay, I'm gonna go back to my share screen.
Nick, as you're doing that, just to clarify, would it help you for the city to have those units and provide them, or to change zoning so that those units could be provided?
I would
Do you-
prefer the first, but I'd take the second. You know, if all we can do is change the zoning to make it available and work with community partners to develop it, then great. If the city of Marquette wanted to develop this on their own, that would be a tremendous step in the right direction for the community.
Do you find that other cities are actually acting as developers?
Yes, and I think if we want to look at a good role model, Ann Arbor is a good role model for us to follow up. Their city is directly involved in their local planning body and the homeless services. And Steve Powers, former city manager of Marquette, was an integral part of getting the city in partnership with their homeless services down in Ann Arbor. And they've had a lot of success. But just to get to the question, this small graph, which you might not be able to read, for Region 1, according to the last study done, we need 183 rapid rehousing units to adequately serve the need in our area. That's just where we pay for the person's apartment for an agreed amount of time so they can work on whatever it is that prevents them from maintaining their housing. The other that Ryan's talking about, which is that really intense case management that comes with apartments, that's permanent supportive housing. Apparently we need 73 units. And Ryan, my number differs a little, but not by much. I had that we had 20 units in the whole UP for permanent supportive housing. And Marquette County alone needs 73.
So that's isn't region 1 the whole UP?
I'm sorry, you're right. That is all region 1.
Okay.
And then a breakdown of the stat earlier, 216 people in Marquette County went through an eviction diversion program in the fall, and they had to present an eviction notice to even qualify for that program. So there's 216 people that almost went homeless in Marquette County this last fall. And then Ryan, go ahead and take part 2 of Evan's question.
Hey, Nick, can I ask real quick, how are people being evicted right now? Is it because of behavior? Because they can't be evicted for non-payment.
I don't have the data on that.
I think it's a combination. If it was not a federally backed mortgage, they could evict people.
No, they could not.
Well,
not until February.
Not until February?
Correct. And the HUD backed and federal backed ones are March 31st, and then that got extended.
And that, if anything, your question should only further highlight my point of concern surrounding eviction, because you're right, there's a number of people who aren't getting evicted right now because of moratoriums, or that might not be the right word, but the eviction, you can't evict people right now. Yeah, so we're not even seeing all the people that could potentially be evicted for lack of payment. These are just people that, for whatever reason, did receive an eviction notice, and that number went from, again, 216 people between September and February. And that's Marquette County.
I have a concern about accessibility with your housing opportunities. It sounds to me like if you have a homeless person who has major mobility limitations, like uses a wheelchair, they're going to be out of luck. They're not going to be able to get into any of these housing facilities. And that, I think, is a serious problem. It's a serious concern for me.
Agreed. And I think the answer to people with disabilities, we obviously can't rely on all private landlords to have ADA accessibility. That would come from I would think, the Housing Commission to make sure, and they do a good job providing ADA units, but making sure there's enough of them. And we do have an ADA part of our shelter for people with disabilities.
You do?
Yes, we do. It's completely ADA accessible on the first floor with its own bedding and its own bathrooms.
Okay, that's a good start.
Nick, do you guys work with SAIL on some of the disability issues?
Yes, we work directly with SAIL. All guests who identify with a disability have access to SAIL services through our guest advocate.
All right, thanks.
I have a question. What, and I don't know if this is for Dennis, but what type of zoning would you need to provide the permanent supportive housing? Or, I mean, you're telling me you can't purchase a home somewhere in the city and just use it as a rental property and have people living in it?
Ryan,
We have, yeah, I'd need clarification on that because we do allow for intentional community housing with our new land development code. So please, by all means, let me know.
That seems like a big area that we could address city-wise, because that's all we can really talk about is things the city of Marquette can do. And if that already exists, that's awesome. And if it doesn't, that could possibly be a recommendation as to allow that type of housing. But I don't understand why it wouldn't be allowed right now, I guess.
I agree. Brian, can you provide? Sorry, Jackie.
Nope, I'm done. I'll be quiet.
I was just going to say, Ryan, can you provide some clarification on that? That would be, that might tie into my original question as well.
100%, because I'm the guy to fix it. So let me know.
Specifically stated in the zoning code, permanent supportive housing is not mentioned. An intentional community is an intentional community. It's more vague in its approach. So specific wording towards permanent supportive housing is not in the zoning code.
But does that
preclude it from existing?
Well, you can't blanket any one thing. You can't negate any one thing, such as permanent supportive housing from any zoning code. And so that's where I'm going with it.
We can't discriminate like that. You can't arbitrarily zone something out of your community. You have to make a space for every one of those. And my thoughts are on that is I think we already have it covered under intentional community, but I'd be happy to get back to the committee on that.
Yeah, and from my understanding and our lawyer's understanding, it just wasn't specifically stated in there that yes, they're special use permit or whatever, the intentional community, but it's not specifically worded for permanent supportive housing.
Could I address this a little bit?
Please, sir.
So perfect.
We have a bunch of categories that are related to this. Most of those categories require some kind of state licensing. And I think this is one of the issues with this recovery housing model is it may not fall into any of those categories that have state licensing requirements. But we also, you know, the 616 Fisher Street is technically it's a boarding house. And we have been using some administrative discretion as this was turned into something else. And it's a long story, but let me just say, we've been using administrative discretion with both that facility and the 239 West Baraga. Whether it's an intentional community or not has to be determined by the Planning Commission upon a request to have that approved as an intentional community facility. We only have one of those in the city that's been approved because this was a new thing that we approved, and most of those kind of things are the way they were defined as they have multiple owners. An intentional community, the Climbers Co-op is the intentional community that exists in Marquette now. And it was based on the model that exists. There's like 75 of these in Ann Arbor. They have multiple owners. They're not an intentional community. The way it was designed was not foreseen as anything like this. So we have another category called health services. Those are establishments that provide diagnostic services and general medical and outpatient care And it can include inpatient, outpatient mental health and substance treatment abuse. So that doesn't necessarily match up with what we're talking about here. So although we have all of these categories, we have foster homes, foster care facilities for adults. We have a variety of different things, but nothing is specific to this. So I think what this is going to take is the city commission to put their heads together, and I defer to Dennis on this because that's his role, is to communicate this with the city commission.
I got an easy solution.
Yeah,
Permanent supportive housing added to intentional community definition. We're done.
that could be it, but it's going to take the city commission to amend our code. We're going to have to go through a code amendment to make that permanent.
Yeah, so we could add this, not speaking on behalf of the committee, but when you do your final report, this might be add the term permanent supported housing to that definition.
If
So
I
it
could,
sounds to me like what Ryan said is correct then, that currently they can't do that.
And that still requires a special land use permit right now.
and if I could make a suggestion or kind of to answer Evan's question, something that this committee could be responsible for is also just kind of running data on what the current amount of rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing units are, because those are the two main answers to getting people out of homelessness. And then also keep a running tally of, and it's done by the state, so no work needed by the commission, what the recommended number of those units available in our community should be. And part of—
So not that,
Go ahead.
sorry, not to say that that's what our committee should do, but in our final recommendation, we should recommend to the city that those two be tracked.
Right.
Those numbers that are currently tracked be included in our local tracking.
Yep, because remember, part of my presentation was to say that, and really, Ryan has a more specific ask of zoning, and we both are after rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing. But one big thing I'm after is just for the city to regularly be an advocate for homelessness, just the whole commission, and to have, again, I don't need to sit here and educate you all how 911 works and how the emergency room works. The whole city needs to know, though, what happens if I don't have a place to sleep tonight, or if my sister and her family doesn't have a place to sleep tonight and they can't stay with me. What are the options? This community needs to know that like the back of their hand.
I have another question. So the Marquette Housing Commission is able to provide permanent housing for low income or no income residents. So, and I'm not saying that we're able to, but if the Housing Commission was able to add additional housing, are you saying that permanent options is not the most necessary thing right now, that we would need to provide the rapid response type of housing or things like that? Or what, I guess if we had, all the money in the world and we could just start building, what type of housing should we provide?
More units is obviously number one. More units would be better for all the different levels of acuity, right?
Okay.
For if Evan ended up homeless tonight to the highest level acuity person, more units solves the problem. But what Ryan and I are talking about is that more units with some specifically reserved as rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing. Because again, right now, if you just added 10 more apartments to Marquette, I bet you 9 of those 10 go to a college kid first, whose parents can foot the bill and don't have a bad rental history and don't have the barriers that the clients or guests we serve do. So again, it's not about more units, it's about the specific reservation of certain units for certain individuals.
So I have a question, and I don't mean to sound or come off callous, but I'm going to say what I will be told.
Okay.
What do we say, or how do you handle the response from members of the public who say, just like they say with high-end condos, I don't want that in my neighborhood?
Well, I would go back to my part of my presentation where I talked about the police contacts. If you want to take a look at what Marquette looked at without housing services and homelessness, let's go take a look at it really quick. So again, I get a monthly report of all the police contacts, right? And police contacts could be, hey, somebody's drunk in my driveway and passed out. I don't know who this guy is. The police show up, they find out he's homeless, it ends up in my report. The owner of Gene K's called me one time. There was a guy sleeping in his storage shed because he didn't have a place to go. So here are your top 3 reasons for police contacts: open alcohol, trespass, drunk and falling down, sleeping somewhere. First of all, none of those are crimes if you do them in your own home or a place where it's reserved or you have a place to go, such as a shelter. And you asked a question about, well, what would you say to, I don't want that in my backyard? Well, if you don't have it in your backyard, those people are still going to be here, and they are literally going to be in your backyard and in your businesses and in your downtown. So here is a time graph of those police contacts. It goes from November of 2017 to September of 2018. Again, the average is 40 contacts a month. The low being 19 contacts in a month, 72 being the highest. The number jumped from 32 contacts to 72 contacts in a month when Room at the Inn used to shut down for the summer and would go to reduced hours. We see police contacts jump up. When Room at the Inn opened its services again, the numbers went back down to 34. Since opening our permanent shelter with 24/7 services, we now see 8 police contacts a month. So for those concerned members of the community, homeless people are going to be here whether we like it or not. And the argument, oh, they're not from here, I'll debunk that in a second too. But also, there are lots of people who probably grew up in Marquette and ended up homeless in other communities. Are we supposed to take them back? Should they all be sent back to us? Should we go retrieve them? The other big retort or negative people, I guess, comment we get or concern is, where are these people from? You know, they're not our neighbors. Well, that's not true at all. From the same police contacts over 5 months in 2018, 123 people were recorded to police contacts. Over 50% were from either Alger, Gwynn, Ishpeming, or Marquette. At least 69% of those individuals were from the UP. An additional 13% from Michigan, an additional 11% from the Midwest. Only 7% were from outside the Midwest. Either way, the 69% being Upers, those are our neighbors, and we're one of the only there's few services throughout the UP. Another thing, in 2019, 59 of 89 files that I went through, 59 of them were from Marquette County. These are our neighbors, they need our help.
Thank you for that, Nick. And I think we're running a little bit short on time, but maybe we'll have time for one more quick question here. But I think it's also important to, one thing I try telling people is, we want an actual solution to homelessness. I know the mission of your organization is to eventually to not have homelessness in Marquette. And, as you said, there's always going to be homeless folks in Marquette unless we can find some kind of solution, right? Does anybody else have any final questions for Nick or Ryan real quick? Because I want to be respectful of their time, and I also want to make sure that Sharon and Jackie have enough time.
One question. They're talking about looking for reasonably priced apartments for these people. They say, oh, well, we'll pay the rent. Who's going to pay the $2,000–3,000 you need to fix up the unit when they leave?
That's where permanent supportive housing comes into place. Permanent supportive housing provides a case manager, which actively not only checks up on the individual, but also the unit. And Ryan, I think, has great potential as an organization to serve as a pseudo landlord, where he goes, hooks somebody up with an apartment and say, you're the landlord, Wayne. Ryan would come to you with a caseworker. He'll say, hey, I have somebody that needs to move into the apartment, and he'll come with wraparound case management. Whoever Ryan's case manager is going to check in with you daily, weekly, monthly, whatever you prefer, make sure that the unit's well kept, that the person's meeting all the agreements of the housing program, and that they're not deteriorating people's investment. And honestly, my dad's a landlord. I'm buying a duplex right now. I'm about to be a landlord. If I just knew that there was somebody else responsible for maintaining it, I would have, and if there was an incentive along with me renting to somebody who needed the housing, we can solve a lot of people's problems very quickly, Wayne. And we can eliminate that concern about the landlord's investment.
Good answer.
Doesn't answer the question. Question was, who's gonna pay for the damage?
There won't be damages because the case manager will ensure that those are prevented. And if there are, then that would fall on, that could be in the agreement that it falls on the organization who is responsible for maintaining that. And again, the beauty about this not being in place is we can take ideas from other communities and cater it to what we want. If we wanted to have a housing program where we said that, hey, if we're going to rent to these people, it should be on the people running the permanent supportive housing programs to be responsible for the damages.
And that's something that we're working with MISHDA. Sorry, Nick, but that's something that we're working with MISHDA is those incentives and those funds to make repairs and even improvements to landlords to incentivize them coming on board.
I would make one suggestion that if you do try to private landlord, you need to make sure that the funding is available for an entire year. It takes us basically a minimum of a year, to be able to cover our turn costs, as well as renting and normal experiences. Because if you don't get a year life expectancy out of a resident, it's not worth it to do it. And when MISHDA and different organizations say, oh, well, we'll pay 3 months, well, we'll pay 6 months. Well, you don't get that longevity. And, even if they're perfect tenants, you still got to go in there and clean it up and touch it up and re-advertise and re-rent it. And there's a lot of expenses that go along with that. So if you can't do a year-long program for that person and back it to the landlord, it's too expensive for us.
Noted. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Mark. And Nick and Ryan, thank you very much. I really do appreciate you guys being with us. And I do apologize, but I think we got to move on to our final presentation here in Q&A about low-income housing in Marquette, just in the interest of time. But I want to thank you both for being here. Nick, if you could send along that presentation and some of that data you were talking about, that would be awesome. I can share that with the committee.
Sure.
And I want to thank you both for being here.
Yep. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here, guys.
Yep.
Thanks, guys.
Yep, thanks.
All right. Well, so Sharon, Jackie, I think you guys are up next. So if one of you wants to share your screen, I think you get a brief presentation about low-income housing and public low-income housing here at Marquette.
Yeah, I'm going to do the abbreviated version of what we presented to the City Commission. So this will only take a couple minutes. I'm going to skip through a bunch of slides, I think, because I think mostly what we're interested in is going to be the occupancy rates and things like that.
Yeah.
So let me just start this real quick. There we go. Marquette Housing Commission. So we're chartered under the state of Michigan to provide and administer affordable housing programs for citizens of the city. And that's what we do. We provide affordable housing to low and moderate income individuals and families. And we also want to promote personal responsibility and self-sufficiency to our residents. This is just essentially our board and our staff. I don't know if you guys necessarily need to know the names. So we currently have 257 units of public housing within the city, and that's split up between Pine Ridge, which administers 140 elderly and disabled units, and also Lake Superior Village, which provides 117 family units of 2, 3, and 4 bedroom townhouses. We also run a voucher program that administers up to 50 housing vouchers in and around the city of Marquette. We are Section 8 multifamily housing. That's where our funding comes from, also from tenant rents. We recently underwent conversion. It was many years in the making. We went through the RAD process, which essentially allows us private and public partnerships so that we can leverage more funding and have a more stable funding stream from the government. We also have some laundry facilities that bring in some money, and we rent rooftop antennas on Pine Ridge as well. So here's our Pine Ridge facility. Again, 140 units. There's 1, 2, and 3 bedrooms. There are some handicap accessible units here, ADA compliant. Tenants pay roughly 30% of their adjusted gross income with a minimum for utilities. It doesn't include cable and TV, but it does include internet. Or cable and telephones, excuse me. We provide parking. There's library access with computers on the main floor. There is 24-hour maintenance. There's a bus stop on site, so people can use the MARCTran. There's also a large community room, an outdoor seating area, on-site laundry, and small pets are allowed in the units. These numbers might be a little bit different, but they're just about right. This was the presentation we gave to the City Commission a couple months ago, but there's roughly 107 applicants on our wait list. Typically, we're expecting 6 to 12 months a wait time, and we do have preference points for City of Marquette residents at Pine Ridge, as well as working family, disabled, and elderly people. For Lake Superior Village, one of the big pluses is its location. It's right next to the university. It's right off of Wright Street. We're currently undergoing pretty major renovations to the buildings. I don't know if you guys have had a chance to kind of drive by that area, but that's part of the RAD conversion. And so we're updating the units, including the exteriors. And we're also creating 2 more units, one of which is going to be an ADA compliant unit. So there's currently 114 townhomes, family housing. There's also access to public transportation here at Lake Superior Village, and there is on-site management and maintenance as well. In addition to those 2, to Lake Superior Village and Pine Ridge, we also administer a housing choice voucher program that provides rental assistance to people who live in privately owned housing. In this case, families aren't required, obviously, to live at Pine Ridge or Lake Superior. They can live, in other areas in the city. The units have to pass a HUD inspection. They can be anywhere in the county, and the voucher is also portable, so it travels with the tenant rather than the unit. This is a similar system to rents at Pine Ridge. It's roughly 30% of their adjusted gross income, and then the remainder of the rent is what the voucher is for. We're currently assisting just about 38 families in Marquette and the surrounding areas. That doesn't include families with temporary vouchers. And those numbers are kind of always in motion because some people, they opt out of the program. Some people pass away, and so vouchers are kind of opening, and we're trying to fill them as they open as quickly as possible. I'm not going to talk about the fire. I mentioned this before. As part of our RAD conversion, we've been able to do some much needed renovations to LSV units. So they're getting air conditioning system, full kitchen and bath renovations, new siding, new windows, one ADA compliant units being added. And similar renovations are happening at Pine Ridge as well. New windows, we're upgrading our laundry rooms. We've renovated the elevators. We're renovating bathrooms. We're creating 6 accessible apartments. There's new flooring, carpeting throughout. There's quite a bit of updates that have been needed for a while that we're able to pay for now. And that is the incredibly short presentation that I'm providing today. So that leaves some time.
Thank you for that incredibly short but informative presentation, Jackie. I know the commission found this really interesting, and I think our committee probably will too. I have just two quick initial questions. So one, you mentioned that there's 107 folks on the wait list, looking about 6 to 12 months out wait time at Pine Ridge. What are the wait lists looking like and wait times looking like right now for Lake Superior Village and for the housing choice vouchers, respectively?
I'm going to defer to Sharon on that because she's going to be much more knowledgeable about day-to-day operations.
Great.
The Lake Superior Village waiting lists are excessively short at this point. What's happening that's changed since this initial presentation is we have started filling units. So that makes a big difference. For a while we were on hold because of the renovation, and now that we're filling units, what used to be a long waiting list now becomes a short waiting list because we've gone through all these applicants that aren't ready to move, don't have their stuff, their paperwork. One of the things that I really want to let people know is there are barriers to this housing. And as Nick and Ryan were talking about being able to get rapid rehousing, not only do you have to be able to fund that through some type of program, which is usually federal, you also have to eliminate those barriers, which if you have federal funding, you can't eliminate those barriers. So just my little side note. Our Housing Choice Voucher Program, the waiting list is many, many years. It's very, very difficult to get onto that waiting list. But one of the things that we could do in the future is we could allocate some of those vouchers to some permanent supportive housing if we wanted to look at doing some rapid rehousing, have that funding available. And those are lower barrier type funding. So I don't know if that was an answer to your question, but it was a lot more information.
That's helpful. The one other question I did have real quickly before we move to the rest of the committee about rapid rehousing, or not about, not about rapid rehousing, about the RAD conversion. Now I know that, I mean, according to federal policy, and I know like, the Marquette Housing Commission, everybody has the best of intentions, but there is, I was doing some research on this, and nationwide there is a lot of data that suggests that despite federal regulations and laws, that there are, as the RAD conversion process happens in other communities throughout the nation, there has been an increase in nationwide in evictions of folks in low-income housing, in rents in some cases, people who are asked to move out to accommodate renovations, sometimes not allowed to move back in, things like that. And I guess my question would be, how, now that we've gone through this RAD conversion process, how do we prevent that from happening in Marquette?
I don't think that's the intention of the RAD conversion. And I came onto the commission well after that had begun. I was a part of the commission in the final stages, but I would say for my own perspective, that's certainly not the intention of it. The whole point behind it was to get a more stable stream of funding and also to provide the necessary updates to these buildings that really were in need of some renovations. And so that's where I'm coming at it from. I guess I'll let Sharon speak to her opinions on that, but it's certainly not the intention to evict people. It's supposed to be beneficial.
Okay, and one of the things that I can address is the eviction in particular that you were talking about, is displacement. It clearly says in the RAD, all of the RAD literature, that if you need to displace somebody for renovation, you have to move them back in. So if there is a public housing agency that has displaced somebody and they don't move them back in, they are not following the RAD intent, and I'm sure there's some other issues in there. I can see in some instances where there could potentially be more evictions because we are no longer public housing. And public housing evictions tend to be more difficult than private landlord evictions. And there are a lot of public housing entities that are removing the public housing staff and going into a management agency staff. So it's a lot different mindset from a public housing perspective than it is from a private management perspective. So we have chosen to keep public housing staff on site. So we are maintaining our public housing rules, our public housing guidelines. And I think no matter what, we are not going to see an increase in evictions because Marquette judges are still going to see us as public housing, and they're still going to tell us that we need to keep everybody we possibly can.
Thanks. That's really good to know. I just wanted to ask that question because I have seen some concerning nationwide data about that. That it does seem that rules are getting bent and broken in other places. But I'm glad to hear that you're all already ahead of that. So with that, if the committee has
But
other
don't you
questions,
don't you think also evictions happen for a reason? You know, either there's something. It's not like people are just evicted because I don't like you anymore. I mean, evictions happen because a landlord doesn't have to allow someone to stay in a property they own because they're destroying it, they're hurting other people, or they're not paying their bills. I mean, so eviction isn't the evil. I think the behavior that leads to that is what needs to be addressed. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I can also tell you through the Housing Choice Voucher Program, where we're dealing with private landlords, there has been some landlords that just thought the tenant was annoying and wanted to get rid of them. And I do have some tenants that, yeah, they are very annoying, but that doesn't mean you can evict them. And I have had some tenants that, in my opinion, should not have been evicted, have been evicted in both my previous life in multifamily housing and in the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So it's not necessarily always the tenant's issue. There are times where it truly is the landlord's issue. Those are few and far between, however.
And some people shouldn't be landlords either. It goes both ways.
Yes, yes.
And Stephanie, just to echo your point, and it's not to say that there won't ever be evictions or that there won't ever be tenants that present issues, but there are programs that have worked in other communities to mitigate those issues, and we have the right players at the table to implement them here.
And I think the best thing that we're seeing is that there's, if our committee does nothing else but facilitate greater communication between differing parts of the community, I think that in and of itself is a gift to the community.
Definitely.
agreed. Does anybody else have any other questions? We've got about 10 minutes left here. So if anybody has any questions for Sharon or Jackie, or any comments about low-income housing in the community, I thought it was Nick, or I mean, if any of our guests have questions too, I suppose that would be fine, but I'd take committee members first.
I do have one question. It was interesting to see the wait list numbers, but my question is, how does that compare to previous years?
The wait list numbers are actually down from previous years.
That's great.
Sure. And Sharon, when you say previous years, I mean, what time scale are we talking about, just out of curiosity?
My last 10 years of being here.
Okay.
Well, Sharon, do you have any guess as to why they're down? Is there more options or just less opportunity and people just have given up trying to get on the list, or?
There's significant more options. I think the opening of Grandview Marquette, and in my period of time, Oriana Ridge also, there's also been more vouchers in place. So I think all of those people are, I think a lot of the stigma of the base is going away. I shouldn't say a lot, some of it. So we do have more people that are willing to move out there. When you're paying 30% of your income, the reality is there are a whole group of people that can rent at 30% of their income at places such as the base. So I think there's some more landlords out there that are doing a better job with creating good housing.
Okay. Do we have any other questions?
One question. In Superior Village out there, first they're talking about, every other program was talking about, well, we got to move these people on and get them out of this situation they're in. And yet, there's 2 and 3 generations living out there in Superior Village. So apparently we're not trying to help them get out of that situation where they can't, give them an education or a job or something. And when you have
I think
people
the
walk
Housing
up to you
Commission,
and say, you're stupid for working, I've got everything you've got and more, and I don't have to work. Just a little disgusting after a while.
I would say that we're fulfilling our role in providing housing that's necessary, and you know, us providing extra services to get people out of that housing, I don't know is necessarily the role of the Housing Commission. I think there's other agencies that exist that do that. We're here to provide housing for people that need it, and I think that's what we do, and I think that Sharon does an excellent job in doing that.
Agreed.
Thank you. And Wayne, I also want to say, I can tell you there is, and I agree with what you're saying. There are definitely instances of everything that you're saying. And there is one generational family that I'm aware of that right now the entire family has moved out. The father bought a house, the ex-wife moved to a different area. So they did move on. So we do have several people that move on. And one of the things that I've prided myself on is looking at our statistics and where people go from here. And it used to be 60-70% roughly were evicted for bad behavior. Now we've got 10 to 20% of our folks that are moving on to home ownership. So I think it's come a long way. And I think we're going to continue to go a long way. We've got some programs for children out there right now. And we also have a service coordinator on staff who's working on helping people budget, get better jobs. The other thing is nothing is going to change COVID, and nothing is going to change the fact that you can sit at home and get unemployment and not have to work. So until that goes away, I think we're going to continue to struggle with some people saying, I don't want to work.
And I want to just echo to Wayne's comment or question. None of these programs are designed to keep a person dependent on the system. These programs are designed with the end goal in mind of people being independent of these services. And I think Sharon and Ryan would agree with me, our ultimate goal for any homeless person in Marquette is home ownership and independence, the same as I would hope for you or myself or anybody else in this community I cared about. It is not to create a place for freeloaders or an incentive in the community where I don't have to work, I can have all my basic needs met without it. These programs are designed to help these people achieve independence, and they're not going to do it without the help of these programs.
Yeah, I would like just to say that one of the programs that we mimicked was downstate in Pontiac from Grace Gospel Fellowship. And it's something that we're trying to launch here in Marquette. It's a homelessness to home ownership 2-year program. And working closely with the Room at the Inn guests and learning the USDA grants and loans that are available out there and the different kinds of programs. That's something that we're looking at developing in the near future.
That's great. Nick, I think you looked like you had a question earlier. Do you want to go ahead, and I think we have a few more minutes here.
Just a question for Sharon, and it might be a hard question. What is the Housing Commission's, or does the Housing Commission have discretion when somebody's been denied an application? Do you have total administrative discretion to, somebody has a criminal charge of making meth in their home or in subsidized housing, and there's a certain time period that has to go by before they make it into housing. What is the housing authority's discretion in saying whether or not somebody can appeal their denial into housing or not? I'm just general question.
In that particular instance, meth is written in the 24 CFR, which is basically the guidelines from HUD, that if you have a meth conviction, you cannot be in HUD housing.
Okay. And so there's zero. No,
we have zero discretion.
Okay. Just making sure I understood correctly.
I think one thing I want to remind our whole committee on is, our biggest thing is, homelessness is a big problem, but there's only so much we can tackle. I think our big thing is we need to find ways in Marquette, and I think everybody will agree, we need some more housing units, and we need to make sure that we're welcoming people that want to come in and develop here. very, very expensive. Labor is extremely difficult. You know, everything in Marquette is difficult right now. So if we do find people that want to come in here and develop, you know, we've got to welcome them. We've got to make it as easy as possible. And the whole goal here is to get more housing, whether it's subsidized or private marketplace. And it kind of sounds like that's the direction we need to go.
So I have a question from the two developer construction folks out there. Is
Go
this
ahead.
a good environment to build housing today?
Absolutely not.
That is
You didn't
correct.
even wait a second.
The rents are too low and the expenses are extremely high. I'm not saying we want rents to go up, but I mean, look at what you have to pay for your employees right now. It's pretty much doubled in the past few years. You know, material prices have gone up 300% on most aspects for building. You
And
know,
are you talking about that's not just COVID related? I mean, that's just
No.
generally going up.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, some of those challenges, we are at 12 p.m. and I want to be respectful of people's time. A lot of those challenges, just to briefly kind of conclude our meeting here, I think we had a really good discussion. Our next meeting in May is going to be, I'm trying to remember the exact date. I think it's May 11th. Yeah, it's Tuesday, May 11th. And at that meeting, we'll be having a couple of more guests who will be helping, you know, talk with us about exactly some of the things we were touching on at the end here. How do you maybe get some more how do you maybe find some creative ways to develop more affordable or like middle income housing in Marquette? How do you help people attain home ownership, which is another blind spot that was identified by some folks in our initial report. So I think that'll be a really productive and interesting meeting, and we'll have another really great discussion at that time. And I also just want to state that we've done 3 of the one-on-one stakeholder interviews. Dennis, as our vice chair, was able to attend the most recent one with me, where we were talking with an expert on NMU student housing, and that was really interesting. And then we also talked with folks from Marquette Habitat for Humanity, and also with someone who administered a lot of housing rehabilitation programs in the UP in the past. So all 3 of those conversations, I took detailed notes and tried to be just as thorough and objective as possible in those notes. And I'll be sharing those with the committee later today or tomorrow morning at the very latest. So you'll all have an opportunity to check those out as well. And hopefully those notes will be from those interviews will be helpful as we're assembling our final report. But with that, does anybody have any final comments before we all head out?
Thank you for having me.
Just in talking about home ownership, there is a virtual conference all day Saturday, the UP Home Buyers Summit. And it's on Facebook, but I know I'm presenting at 1, but that'll be going on all day. If people know of people who are interested in the process, whether it's now or a year from now, and I'll be sharing that on my Facebook as well.
And I just wanted to say thank you, and I encourage everyone here, if you get the chance, to come volunteer at Room at the Inn. We're a wonderful organization, and volunteering is the best way to learn about homelessness.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for having us.
For sure.
Thank you guys.
Everybody have a nice day.
Thanks.